high voice called through the dark rooms. "Mommy!" The cry made him jump. For a second, his consciousness could not come up with a name. Ethel? No, not Ethel, but Katrine. A second later, his own name floated up from his memory. Joachim Westin, and he was lying in the double bed in Eel Point Manor House on northern Åland. Joachim was at home. He had been living here for 1 day. His wife, Katrine, and their 2 children had been living on the estate for 2 months, while he himself had only just arrived. Katrine was sleeping deeply. He heard the cry once again, "Mommy!" He recognized Livia's high voice. It made him throw aside the cover and get out of bed. The manor house at Eel Point was closed off to the land, but open towards the sea. Joachim went over to the windows in the hall and looked out towards the coast. A red light was flashing there, coming from one of the twin lighthouses. He heard the wind howling around the house and saw restless shadows, waves. They always made him think of Ethel, despite the fact that it wasn't the waves but the cold that had killed her. It was only 10 months ago. Joachim stepped carefully over the wide wooden threshold and into Livia's bedroom. "Mummy?" "No," said Joachim. "Just Daddy." She looked up at him. "Have you been here long, Daddy?" "No." "There was somebody here." "You were just dreaming." Livia nodded and closed her eyes. She was already on her way back to sleep. Next morning, she wouldn't remember that he'd been there. He peeped into the other bedroom. Everything was silent in here. Gabriel, aged 2.5, was lying in his little bed over by the wall, a motionless bundle. Gabriel slept almost 10 hours, straight through. Katrine was still fast asleep when he got back to his own bed. That morning, the whole family went down to the shore. Walking down to the water at Eel Point felt like arriving at the end of the world. 100 yards or so away from them, the white towers of the lighthouses rose up towards the dark blue sky. Livia suddenly set off towards the wide jetty leading out to the lighthouses. "Me too, shouted Gabriel, but Joachim held him tightly by the hand. "We'll go together," he said. The jetty split like a big letter Y, with the narrower arms leading out to the islands where the lighthouses stood. Katrine shouted, "Don't run, Livia! Be careful of the water!" "The stones could be slippery," said Joachim. He picked Gabriel up and held him in the crook of his right arm. There was only a slight wind today, but Joachim could sense the power of nature. Winter after winter of drift ice and harsh storms. "Careful, Livia," said Joachim, looking down into the black water below the stone track. The entrance to the lighthouses was a stone archway some 3 feet deep. There was no keyhole, just a crossbar with a rusty padlock, and when Joachim got hold of the side of the door and pulled, it didn't move an inch. "Don't the lighthouses belong to us, Mummy?" said Livia as they made their way back to the shore. She sounded disappointed. "Well, yes," said Katrine. "Sort of. But we don't have to look after them, do we, Kim?" She smiled at Joachim, and he nodded. "The house will be quite enough." Katrine had turned over in the double bed while Joachim was with Livia, and as he crept beneath the covers, she reached out for him in her sleep. He breathed in the scent of her and closed his eyes. Peace. Then he heard the faint whimpering from Livia's room again, and he held his breath. "Mommy!" Katrine sat up. Unlike Joachim, she could go from deep sleep to wide awake in a couple of seconds. "I'll go." Katrine got out of bed without hesitating, slid her feet into her slippers, and quickly pulled on her dressing gown. "Mommy!" It wasn't good that Livia wanted to sleep with her mother beside her every night, but it was a habit that had started the previous year, when Livia had begun to have disturbed nights, perhaps because of Ethel. "See you, lover boy," said Katrine, slipping out of the room. All was silent in the manor house. His life in the country had begun. Henrik wasn't keen on the Sorelius brothers, but he was stuck with them. Tommy and Freddie weren't from the island. They were friends of Morgan Berglund. They had rung the doorbell of Henrik's little apartment in Borgholm at the end of September at around 10 o'clock when he was just thinking of going to bed. "Abba, Baba, Henky," said one of them. "How's it going?" "Okay, I suppose," said Henrik slowly. "Who are you?" "Tommy and Freddie, the Sorelius brothers. Hell, you must have heard of us, Henrik. You must know who we are." Then the brothers took a quick tour of his one-bedroom flat and slumped down on the sofa in front of the TV. "Got any crisps?" said Freddie. "Your pal Mog says hi," said big brother Tommy. "It was Mog who thought we should come here." "To Siberia," said Freddie, pulling the bowl of crisps Henrik had provided towards him. "Mog? Morgan Berglund?" "Sure thing," said Tommy, sitting down on the sofa next to his brother. "You're pals, right?" "You can't stay here," said Henrik. Tommy didn't appear to be listening. "We're Satanists," he said. "Did we mention that?" "Satanists?" said Henrik. "You mean devil worshippers?" Tommy wasn't smiling. "We don't worship anyone," he said. "Satan stands for the strength within human beings. That's what we believe in. Have you heard of Aleister Crowley? We're thinking of working here on Oland, so we need a bit of help." "With what?" "Mog told us what you and he used to do in the winter. He told us about the summer cottages." "I see." "He said you'd be happy to start up again." "Thanks for that, Mog," thought Henrik. "Old houses are real treasure troves," said Tommy. "So you're in? We need you to find our way round there." Henrik didn't say anything. He was thinking that a person who has a miserable, predictable life must be miserable and predictable themselves. He didn't want to be like that. "So we're agreed then," said Tommy. "Okay?" "Maybe," said Henrik. "Abba Baba," said Tommy. "Great," said Freddie. "And all we have to do is find the right houses. Mog said you know some good places." "Some," said Henrik. "It goes with the job." "Give us the addresses, then we can check if they're safe." "What are you talking about?" "We'll ask Aleister." "What?" "We usually chat with Aleister Crowley," said Tommy, placing his bag on the table. He opened it and took out a narrow, flat box made of dark wood. "We contact him using this." Henrik looked on in silence as Tommy unfolded the box and placed it on the table. Letters, words and numbers were seared into the wood on the inside of the box. The entire alphabet was there, plus numbers from 0 to 10, and the words yes and no. Then Tommy took a small glass out of his bag. "I tried this out when I was a kid," said Henrik. "The spirit in the glass, isn't it? This is serious," said Tommy. He placed the glass on the unfolded box. "This is a Ouija board." "A Ouija board?" "That's what it's called," said Tommy. "Can you turn the lights down a little?" He placed his little finger on the glass and closed his eyes. The room fell silent. "Who's there?" he asked. "Is Aleister there?" Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then the glass began to move beneath Tommy's finger. 4 days later, Henrik and the Sorelius brothers made their first trip north, to the cluster of summer cottages which Henrik had selected and Aleister had approved. There were only closed-up houses there, pitch black in the darkness. Henrik and the brothers weren't looking for small, expensive objects when they broke open a window and got into a cottage. They knew no summer visitors were stupid enough to leave cash, designer watches or gold necklaces behind in their cottages over the winter. But certain things were too difficult to transport home from the country when the holiday was over. Televisions, music systems, bottles of spirits, boxes of cigarettes and golf clubs. And in the outhouses there could be chainsaws, cans of petrol and electric drills. Tommy said something, and Henrik called back. "Where are you?" "Here, just off the kitchen." "It's some kind of office." Henrik followed Tommy's voice through the narrow kitchen. He was standing by the wall in a windowless room, pointing with his gloved right hand. "What do you think of this?" He wasn't smiling, but he was looking up at the wall with the expression of someone who might have made a real find. A large wall clock was hanging there, made of dark wood with Roman numerals behind the glass covering the clock face. Henrik nodded. "Yeah, could be worth something. Is it old?" "I think so," said Tommy. "Come on, let's get it outside." The van was parked close to the house, in the shadows at the back. It had Kalmar Pipes and Welding on the sides. Tommy had bought plastic letters and stuck them on himself. There was no such welding company in Kalmar, but driving around in a company van at night looked less suspicious than in some anonymous old delivery van. "They're opening a police station in Marnus next week," said Henrik as they were lifting the clock out through the veranda window. There was almost no wind tonight, but the air was fresh and cold. "How do you know?" said Tommy. "It was in the paper this morning." He heard Freddie's hoarse laugh in the darkness. "Ah, well, that's it then," said Tommy. "You might as well ring them and shop the two of us. Then you might get a reduced sentence." He dropped his lower lip, showing his teeth. That was his way of smiling. They placed the clock in the back of the van alongside a collapsible exercise bike, 2 large vases made of polished limestone, and television with stereo speakers that were already in there. Tommy started the engine as Henrik climbed into the passenger seat. Then he lifted off a section of the door panel and reached inside. Wrapped in small pieces of kitchen paper was ice, crystal meth. "Want another?" said Tommy. "No, I've had enough." The crystals were like a kick up the backside, but if Henrik took more than one hit per night, he started quivering like a flagpole. "Okay, let's go to the boathouse." They unloaded the stolen goods by the beam of torches. It was as dark as a cave down here by the sea. Tommy reached down and pulled out a large black woolen cap. Then he held the black fabric up to the torch, and Henrik could see that it wasn't a cap. It was the kind of hood robbers wear, a balaclava, with holes for the eyes and the mouth. "My suggestion is that we put these on next time," said Tommy, "and move on from the summer cottages." "Move on? Move on to what?" "Houses that aren't empty." There was silence for a few moments. "I know. The risks increase," said Tommy, "but so do the gains." It wasn't really about the money. Henrik had a good trade these days. It was mostly the excitement he was after. It chased away the tedium of everyday life. "I'm in, if we take it easy, and nobody gets hurt." They set off south across the island, back towards Borgholm. After 20 minutes they were in town, where rows of street lamps drove away the October darkness. But the pavements were just as empty as the country roads. Tommy slowed down and pulled in by the apartment block where Henrik lived. "Good," he said. "In a week then? Tuesday night, next week?" "Sure." "You like living out here in the middle of nowhere?" Henrik nodded. "OK," said Tommy. "Don't start trying to do any deals of your own with the stuff. We'll find a buyer in Kalmar." "Fine," said Henrik, closing the door of the van. 5 hours before the alarm woke him for his ordinary job, he thought about all the houses on the island where people lay sleeping, settled. He'd get out if anything happened. If anyone woke up when they broke in, he'd just get out of there. The brothers, and their spirit in the glass, could fend for themselves. Tilda Davidson was sitting with her bag containing the tape recorder in the residential home for the elderly in Marnus, in the room of her relative Gerlof Davidson. She had had to wait, because he had to listen to the weather forecast. Tilda didn't really understand why it was so important. He was hardly likely to be going out in this cold, but presumably keeping an eye on the wind and the weather was a routine left over from his days as captain of a cargo ship on the Baltic. Gerlof had agreed to the recording almost without thinking when she had called him in August and said she was moving to Marnus, but it still seemed to be making him a bit tense. "Is it on?" he said quietly. "Is the tape running?" "No, not yet," said Tilda. "I'll tell you when." She pressed down the record button and nodded encouragingly at Gerlof. "Right, we've started." Tilda straightened up, and it seemed to her that her voice was more tense and formal than usual as she went on. "This is Tilda Davidson, and I am in Marnus with my grandfather, Ragnar's brother, Gerlof, to talk about our family and about my grandfather here in Marnus." Tilda left the Marnus home just after 4:30 with the tape recorder in her rucksack. She had agreed with Martin that she would call him around 6 before he went home from work. Before that, she had time to take a look at her future workplace. The new police station in Marnus was in a side street a couple of blocks from the square. Tilda took the station keys out of her pocket, but when she got to the front door, it was already unlocked. She could hear men's voices inside. 2 burly middle-aged men were standing inside. One of them was in the dark blue police uniform, the other in civilian clothes. Tilda had met one of them before, the one in civilian clothes, Inspector Guter Homblad, who was in charge of the local police. "Hello there," he said. "Welcome to the new district." "Thank you." She shook hands with her boss and turned to the other man, who had thinner black hair, bushy eyebrows, and was in his 50s. "Tilda Davidson." "Hans Mania. I guess the 2 of us will be working together up here." He didn't sound completely convinced that this would work out well. The police chief opened his mouth again, but at that moment the telephone on the wall rang. He picked up the phone. "Right," he said eventually. "We'd better get out there." He put the phone down. "That was Borgholm. The emergency number has had a call about an accidental death on northern Åland." Mania got up from his empty desk. "Local?" "By the lighthouses off Eel Point," said Homblad. "The ambulance is already on its way. Evidently it's a drowning." Joachim's 3rd morning in the manor house at Eel Point was his last completely happy start to the day for many years, perhaps ever. Unfortunately, he was too stressed to register how good he felt. He would be driving some 270 miles today to pick up the last of their possessions from the house in Bromma. Several parents were dropping off their children on the pavement in front of the school, and Joachim stopped at the end of the row of vehicles without switching off the engine. "Watch out for the cars," said Joachim. "Stay on the pavement." "Bye," said Livia, opening the car door. It wasn't a protracted farewell. She was used to him being away. Gabriel said nothing. When Joachim helped him out of the seat, he just charged away. "Bye then," Joachim called after them. "See you tomorrow." He put the car in gear and swung across the road, back towards Eel Point. Joachim parked next to Katrine's car. "Hello?" he called out in the porch. "Katrine!" There was silence for a few moments. Then he heard a muted scraping from the inner courtyard. It was the sound of the big black wooden barn door being opened. Katrine stepped out of the darkness and waved to him. "What were you doing?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "Are you leaving now?" Joachim nodded. "Drive carefully. When you get home, I'll tell you about the loft." "The loft?" "The hay loft in the barn," said Katrine. "I'll show you tomorrow," she said. He opened the car door. "Don't forget to pick up our little lambs." Joachim had a couple of things to do in the capital. The first was to call in at a small gallery in Oostermalm to pick up a landscape painting, the Ramba painting. It was in a flat wooden box, fastened with screws. "We looked at it yesterday before we packed it," said the woman. "Incomparable. Are there any of the others left on Åland?" "I don't know. The royal family has one, I think, but it's hardly likely to be hanging in some drawing room in Soljuden." With the painting safe in the boot, Joachim drove west towards Bromma. Everything was quiet. The only neighbours whose house was in sight were the Heslins, Lisa and Michael, and they had become good friends with Katrine and Joachim, but there were no cars on their drive this afternoon. Beside the fence, a narrow track led through a grove of trees. No one had seen Ethel walking down the track that evening, but it was the shortest route down to the water. He unlocked the door, opened up and walked in. He wandered through the rooms, perhaps for the very last time. Upstairs, he stopped in the doorway of one of the 2 guest bedrooms for a few seconds. Ethel had slept here when she was living with them. Some of their things were still down in the cellar. Joachim was packing them into a cardboard box when he suddenly heard the front door opening on the floor above. He straightened up and listened. "Hello?" came a woman's voice. "Joachim?" It was Katrine, and she sounded anxious. He heard her close the front door behind her and walk into the hallway. "Down here," he shouted, "in the cellar." He listened, but there was no reply. He took a step towards the cellar stairs, still listening. When everything remained deathly silent up above, he quickly went upstairs, realizing at the same time how improbable it was that he would see Katrine standing there in the hallway. And of course, she wasn't there. Joachim spent the next 10 minutes going through the entire house, room by room, despite the fact that he knew he wasn't going to find Katrine anywhere. It was impossible. She was still on Åland. He'd misheard. He must have misheard. He took out his mobile and keyed in the number for Eel Point. No reply. He rang her mobile. No reply. The rush hour traffic heading for the suburbs was in full swing when he hit the main road, and it took him 45 minutes to get out of the city. When the traffic finally thinned out, Joachim pulled into a car park in Södertälje to call Katrin one more time. The phone rang 4 times, then it was picked up. "Tilda Davidson, who's calling?" "This is Joachim Westin," he said slowly. "I live in the manor house at Eel Point." "I see. Is my wife there, or my children?" asked Joachim. "No. And who are you?" "I'm a police officer," said the woman. "I can't say anything, but it would be best if you got here as quickly as possible. Is it, what's your speed?" said the policewoman, breaking off the conversation. Joachim sat there with the silent mobile to his ear, staring out at the empty car park. He put the car in gear, pulled out onto the road and carried on heading south. But when he began to see pictures in his head of Katrin and the children, he pulled off the road again. The phone rang only 3 times on this occasion. "Davidson?" Joachim didn't bother saying hello or introducing himself. "Has there been an accident?" he asked. "You have to tell me." "Are you still driving?" asked the woman. "Not right now." There was silence at the other end of the phone for a few seconds. Then she replied, "There's been an accident, a drowning." "Death?" said Joachim. "We never give out that kind of information over the telephone." "Possibly, but this time you have to. If someone in my family has drowned, you have to give me the name. Otherwise, I'll just keep on calling." Silence at the other end of the phone. "Just a moment." The woman disappeared again. It felt to Joachim as if several minutes passed. Then there was a scraping noise on the phone. "I have a name now," said the woman quietly. "Whose?" The policewoman's voice was mechanical. "The victim's name is Livia Westin." Tilda Davidson was standing in the big kitchen of the manor house. The whole house was absolutely silent. Even the slight breeze from the sea had died away. She really wanted to hear another voice, but she hadn't got around to ringing Martin this evening, and now it was several hours too late. He would already have gone home from work. Instead, she rang the number of the neighbours, the Carlson family. The mother picked up after 2 rings. "How are they?" asked Tilda. "I've just had a look at them, and they're both asleep," said Maria Carlson. "They're in our guest room." "That's good," said Tilda. "How long will you be up tonight? I was intending to come over with Joachim Westin." "Roger and I will stay up for as long as necessary." At last a bright light swept through the rooms, the headlights of a car. She heard the faint sound of an engine approaching. Joachim Westin had arrived back at Eel Point. As she stepped outside, the car with its trailer was just swinging round to stop in the turning area. The driver switched off the engine and got out. Tilda could barely make out his face in the darkness. "Hi," he said. "Hi, Tilda Davidson, local police. We spoke earlier?" "Livia," said Westin eventually, gazing up at the lit windows of the house. Is she not here?" "She's being taken care of," said Tilda. "They've taken her to Kalmar." "What happened? Where did it happen?" "By the shore, next to the lighthouses." "And Katrin and Gabriel, are they still at the neighbours'?" Tilda nodded. "They've fallen asleep. I rang and checked a while ago." "Is that their place over there?" said Westin, looking towards the lights in the southwest. "The farm?" "Yes." "I'm going over there." "I can drive you," said Tilda. "We can—" "No, thank you. I need to walk." He walked past her, clambered over a stone wall and strode off into the darkness. The bereaved should never be left alone, Tilda had learned during her training, and she quickly set off after him. As they arrived at the Carlson family house, Westin asked quietly, "Who found her? Was it Katrin?" "No," said Tilda. "I think it was one of the staff from the day nursery." Joachim Westin turned his head and gave her a long look, as if he didn't understand what she was talking about. Tilda realized later that she should have stopped on the steps and talked more to him then. Instead, she took 2 more steps up to the door and tapped gently. After a minute or so, a blonde woman came and opened the door. It was Maria Carlson. "Come in," she said. "I'll go and wake them up." "You can let Gabriel sleep," said Joachim. Maria Carlson nodded and disappeared into a dark room. It took a minute or two, then the little girl came out into the light. She was wearing trousers and a sweater, clutching a cuddly toy firmly under her arm, and her expression was sleepy and uninterested as she looked at them. But when she realized who was standing on the other side of the room, she quickly brightened up and began to smile. "Daddy!" she shouted, scampering across the floor. The daughter didn't know anything, Tilda realized. Nobody had told her yet that her mother had drowned. Even more remarkable was the fact that her father, Joachim Westin, was standing stiffly by the door, making no attempt to move towards his daughter. Tilda looked at him and saw that he no longer looked tense, but frightened and confused, almost terrified. Joachim Westin's voice was filled with panic. But this is Livia," he said, looking at Tilda. What about Katrine? My wife? Where's Katrine?" Joachim was sitting waiting on a wooden bench outside a low building at the district hospital in Kalmar. The weather was cold and sunny. Beside him sat a young hospital chaplain. Joachim was refusing to go in. He had seen Ethel in a room like this the previous year. He lowered his eyes and silently shook his head. Eventually the junior doctor nodded. "Wait here then, it'll take a little while." She went into the building. After a few minutes she came back with some Polaroid photographs. She held out the photographs to Joachim. They were close-ups of Katrine's face. Her skin was white and lifeless, and she had small wounds on her forehead and on one cheek. "She's injured," he said quietly. "It's from the fall," said the doctor. "She slipped on the rocks out on the jetty and hit her face before she ended up in the water." "But she drowned?" "It was hypothermia, the shock of the cold water. She took water into her lungs when she went below the surface." "But she fell in the water," said Joachim. "Why did she fall?" Joachim woke up with a start. The sound that had woken him up was no dream. It was Livia calling out, "Mommy!" The clock by the side of the bed was showing 3:15. "Mommy!" She raised her head when he bent over her bed. He stroked her forehead without saying anything. "Mummy," she mumbled. An idea suddenly came into his head. He crept out of the door and into the dark bathroom. He groped his way to the wooden laundry basket. The basket was almost full. Nobody had done any washing for almost a week. Most of the items were hers. Joachim pulled out a red woolen sweater. He went past Gabriel's room and back into Livia's. She had kicked off the coverlet and was waking up. "Sleep now, Livia," said Joachim. "Mummy's here." He placed Katrine's thick sweater close to Livia's face and pulled the coverlet up to her chin. "Hmm?" She mumbled something in her sleep and gradually relaxed. The danger was past, and Joachim knew that next morning she wouldn't even remember that she had been awake. He drove the children into Manus at around 8 each morning, away from the silence of Eel Point. "Bye, Daddy," said Livia when he left her at preschool. "Is Mummy coming home tonight?" "No, not tonight," he said, "but I'll come and pick you up." Livia ran off to join the other children. At the same time, a grey-haired woman looked out of the cloakroom. It was Marianne, the head of the preschool unit. "If you didn't already know, I was the one who found her in the water." Joachim had no questions, but she carried on talking anyway, as if she needed to tell him. "There was no answer when I telephoned, so I put them in my car and drove out to Eel Point. The children ran into the house, but the place was silent and empty. I went out looking, and then I saw something red down in the water by the lighthouses, a red jacket." "The children weren't there? They didn't see Katrine?" "No, they were still in the house. Then I took them over to the neighbours. They didn't see anything." Tilda and Gerloff were back in his room, and her tape recorder was up and running once again. Gerloff was talking about his early days as a teenage skipper on the Baltic. Tilda thought again about the information she'd got wrong the previous week and asked, "What do you know about the manor house at Eel Point, Gerloff?" "Eel Point? Your grandfather was a neighbour." "Was he?" "His cottage was a mile or so further north. Ragnar used to fish for eels off the point, and he was a watchman for the lighthouses." "Are there any stories about the place?" "Well, the manor house does have something of a reputation. They say that the foundations are made of granite from an old abandoned chapel." "Why is there only a light in one tower?" said Tilda. "There was some kind of accident there. I think it was a fire. I suppose it got too expensive to have them both working every night." "I was at the house last week," she said. "Someone drowned." In the end, Tilda told him most of it. She drowned straight away, despite the fact that the water is shallow there.
"Not everywhere. It's deeper out by the jetty. I've seen sailing boats moor there. Did anyone see it happen?"
Tilda shook her head. Gerloff got up with some difficulty and went over to the desk. He took a black notebook out of one of the drawers.
"I always make a note of the weather," he said.
He flicked through to the page he wanted.
"There was hardly any wind that day."
"Yes, I suppose it was. It was calm out at Eel Point."
"So no waves can have raced up the shore and wiped out any traces," said Gerloff.
"No. And the footprints from the woman's shoes were still there in the sand. I saw them myself."
"Was she injured in any way?"
"I only saw her briefly, but she had a small wound on her forehead."
"A graze?"
"Yes. It was probably from the fall. She probably hit her head on the stone jetty when she fell." Gerloff slowly sat down again.
"Any enemies?"
"What?"
"Did she have any enemies, the woman who drowned?"
Tilda sighed. "Do mothers with small children usually have mortal enemies here on the island?"
"What about from the sea? If someone came along the coast in a boat and moored by the jetty on Eel Point, then there wouldn't be any footprints in the sand."
Tilda sighed. "Okay, so I'd better start looking for a boat then." She looked at him and asked, "Gerloff, are you finding these recordings difficult?" Gerloff hesitated.
"I find it a bit difficult to talk about relatives who have died," he said eventually. "It feels as if they're sitting and listening."
"It's mostly grandfather I want to talk about," said Tilda.
"I know, but he might be listening too."
"Was he hard work as an older brother, Ragnar?"
"He had his moments."
"I don't remember him," said Tilda. "Dad never talked about him."
"Ragnar, he froze to death in a winter storm," Gerloff went on. "The body was found on the shore to the south of this cottage. Did your dad tell you that? Ragnar died in the snow."
"Nobody is dead until they are warm and dead," said Tilda. "People have been found frozen stiff and with no pulse in snowdrifts, but they've come back to life when they've been brought into the warmth."
"Who told you that?"
"Martin."
"Martin? Who's he?"
"My boyfriend," said Tilda. "He lives in Vekjoa. He's a teacher."
"Nice,"
Gerloff smiled. Everything seemed so simple when she was sitting here with Gerloff, talking about Martin. Not complicated at all. The funeral took place at 11 o'clock on a Thursday in Marnus Church. The children weren't there. Joachim had dropped them off at preschool, as usual, at 8 o'clock, without saying anything. It was 2 minutes to 11 when the church door opened and a tall, broad-shouldered woman strode in. She was wearing a black coat and a black veil, which concealed her eyes, but her lips were painted with bright red lipstick. Her heels echoed on the stone floor, and many heads turned in the church. The woman marched up and sat down in the pew at the front on the right, next to Katrine's 4 half-sisters and brothers. She was their mother and Katrine's mother, Mira Ramba, Joachim's mother-in-law, the artist and singer. He hadn't seen Mira since their wedding 7 years earlier. In contrast to that particular day, she appeared to be sober now. Just as Mira sat down, the bells began to toll up in the church tower. Finally, it was evening again, and he was back at Eel Point. Inside the house, Livia and Gabriel were being put to bed by their grandmother. Lisa and Michael Heslin were standing by their car out at the front. It was late, and they had a long journey back to Stockholm, but they had still come back to the house with him. "Thanks for coming," said Joachim. "No problem," said Michael, placing his black suit in its plastic covering on the back seat. There was a tense silence. "Come up to Stockholm soon," said Lisa. "Or come over to Gotland, with the children, to our cottage." "Maybe." "We'll be in touch, Joachim," said Michael. Joachim nodded. The November night was dry, but it was cold, dark, and foggy. Perfect weather for break-ins. The house lay up on a ridge and had been built recently. The sliding door to the ground floor was made of glass, fastened with a simple catch. Like a commando, Tommy Sorelius indicated with a hand signal that they should split up, and Henrik went into a living room with a leather sofa. There was something large and shiny under there. It was an old hunting gun with a polished wooden butt and a shoulder strap of well-oiled leather. A small red cardboard box containing cartridges laid beside it. Henrik slipped it over his shoulder. Freddie was busy carrying out an exercise bike. They heard a thud in the darkness, followed by footsteps from upstairs. Then the light on the staircase was switched on. "Hello?" called a man's voice. They all took to their heels at the same time. "Load up!" shouted Tommy, pulling off his hood and climbing in behind the wheel. Henrik and Freddie quickly pushed everything into the back of the van. Tommy floored the accelerator and the van shot away. "We must do that again," said Freddie once they were out on the main road. "What's this?" said Tommy. He had discovered the gun. "I found it in the house," said Henrik. "It's an old Mauser," said Tommy. "Collectors love this sort of thing." "Not too many more," said Henrik when they were back on the road. "What?" "These trips. I can't cope with many more." "We have to do a few more." "2," said Henrik. "I'll go out with you twice more." "OK, where?" Henrik was silent behind the wheel. "A couple of places I know," he said. "A priest's house, where there could be some jewellery, and maybe the manor house at Eel Point." Manya was standing by his desk, tucking into sandwiches. "Hans, could you spare a moment?" "Absolutely, Tilda. I'd really like to talk about your message." "What message?" "The message about the death at Eel Point. You recognise this, I presume?" She held up a piece of paper. 3 names were written in ink. The first was Livia Westin, the second was Katrine Westin, the third was Gabriel Westin. Next to Livia's name was a cross. "So," said Manya, "you were supposed to mark the name of the person who drowned. That's what I asked you to do." Manya was no longer smiling. "And you put the cross in front of Livia Westin's name?" "Yes." "And it was the mother, Katrine Westin, who had drowned?" Manya seemed completely uninterested in the conversation. "OK," he said, "a mistake. Even the police make a mistake sometimes." "Yes, but it was your mistake," said Tilda, "not mine." "Remember," said Inspector Guter Homblad, as they pulled up in front of the house at Eel Point, "you don't have to say anything if you don't want to." Tilda nodded. The door opened. Joachim Westin nodded at Homblad, but didn't acknowledge Tilda. They followed him in. "Coffee?" asked Westin. "Thank you. That would be good," said Homblad. Homblad adjusted his uniform. "We'd very much like to start by saying that this sort of thing simply shouldn't happen." "You've got that right," said Westin. "I thought my daughter had drowned. I thought that for several hours." "As I said, our sincere regrets," said Homblad. "How's the investigation going?" asked Westin. "The investigation? Into my wife's death?" "There is no investigation," said the inspector quickly. "In this case, there are no grounds for suspicion. She walked right to the end of the jetty and jumped into the water." "Nobody's saying it was suicide," said Homblad. Tilda looked out of the window towards the lighthouses and the sea. She thought about Gerloff. "Did your wife have any enemies?" she asked suddenly. Joachim Westin seemed surprised by the question. "No," he said. "Neither of us has any enemies." "So she hadn't been threatened by anyone here on the island?" Westin shook his head. When Guter Homblad had finished his coffee, he got up from the table. "Of course," he said, "you are at liberty to pursue this matter. I want you to know that," but Westin shook his head. "I won't be taking it any further." One day at a time. They never talked about it, but Livia and Gabriel seemed to be under the impression that their mother had simply gone away and would be back. It wasn't good, but at the same time, Joachim had almost begun to believe it himself. The weekend came. The children were at home, playing in Livia's room. Joachim was going to start wallpapering the room in the southwest corner. He had set up a table and mixed a bucket of wallpaper paste after breakfast. He wasn't going to think, he was just going to wallpaper. When he had put up the first 4 lengths, Joachim suddenly heard a faint thudding noise. He went over to the window facing out from the back of the house and opened it. A boy was standing on the grass down below, perhaps a year or 2 older than Livia. At his feet he had a yellow plastic football. "Hi," said Joachim. "What's your name?" "Andreas." "Where do you live?" "Over there." He pointed towards the farm. So Andreas was one of the Carlson family's children. "Would you like to come in?" said Joachim. "You can say hello to Livia and Gabriel," said Joachim. "They're my children." "Livia's the same age as you." Andreas nodded. "For a little while. We'll be eating soon." He picked up his ball and disappeared around the side of the house. Joachim closed the window and went out of the room. "Livia! Gabriel! We've got a visitor!" Andreas walked into the porch, took off his outdoor clothes and dropped them on the floor. Andreas looked at Livia and she looked back. "You could kick the football around for a while," said Joachim. "I know a great room you could use." He led the way into the house with the children following along behind. They came to the large drawing room, which was still almost completely unfurnished. There were just a few cardboard boxes on the floor. "You can play in here," said Joachim, stacking 3 of the boxes in front of the window to protect it. He loved the happy noises spreading through the house. But when only a couple of feet of unpapered wall remained, he realized that the echoing children's laughter could no longer be heard from the drawing room. The house was completely silent again. "Livia!" he called. "Gabriel! Would you like some juice and biscuits?" No reply. Halfway to the drawing room, he looked out of the window into the courtyard. The door to the big barn was standing ajar. Then he saw that Andreas Carlson's outdoor clothes had gone from the floor. Joachim went across and stopped in the doorway of the barn. "Hello?" No reply. Were they playing hide-and-seek? Nothing was moving inside the barn, but Joachim thought he could hear a tapping or creaking noise from the hayloft, up above, like footsteps. A narrow, steep wooden staircase led up to the loft, and he grabbed hold of the sides and began to climb. The winter wind was like a faint whisper above the roof of the barn. He didn't really like being alone up here in the cold. "Livia!" he shouted. The wooden floor creaked in front of him, but he got no other answer. He looked around and listened. "Katrine?" he said quietly. No reply. When he got back into the house, he found his children were where he should have looked in the first place, in Livia's bedroom. "Did you go outside? You and Andreas and Gabriel?" "For a little while." "You mustn't go in the barn," said Joachim. "Did you hide in there?" "No. There's nothing to do in the barn." "Where's Andreas?" "He went home." "Mommy!" Livia's voice made Joachim raise his head, wide awake. The clock radio was showing 23:52. He had slept for an hour. "Mommy!" Livia was lying under the covers with her eyes closed, but Joachim could see her head moving restlessly on the pillow. "Mummy isn't here," he said quietly. "Yes, she is." "Go to sleep now, Livia." She opened her eyes and recognized him. "I can't sleep, Daddy." "Yes, you can." "No," said Livia. "You have to sleep here." Joachim sighed, but Livia was wide awake now, and there was nothing else for it. Cautiously, he lay down on the edge of the bed. It was too short. He'd never be able to get to sleep. He fell asleep after 2 minutes. There was someone outside the house. Joachim opened his eyes in the darkness. He couldn't hear anything, but he could feel that they had a visitor. What time was it? He had no idea. He sat up silently and carefully got off the bed. But after only 3 steps, he heard the voice behind him. "Don't go, Daddy." He stopped and turned around. "Why not?" "Don't go." Joachim couldn't see her face, just her blonde hair. "Are you asleep, Livia?" he asked quietly. "No." Are you sleeping? No, I can see things. Where? In the wall. What can you see? Lights, water, shadows. Can you see any people? She was silent again. Before the reply came, Mummy. Don't ask any more questions, he thought. Go to bed. But he had to carry on. Where can you see Mummy? He asked. Behind the light. Everybody's standing there waiting. And Mummy's with them. Who? Who's waiting? She didn't reply. How's Mummy feeling? She's sad. Sad? She wants to come in. Tell her... Joachim swallowed, his mouth dry. Tell her she can come in any time. She can't. Joachim spoke slowly and clearly. Can you ask Mummy what she was doing down by the water? Livia lay motionless in the bed. There was no response. But he still didn't want to give up. Livia, can you talk to Mummy? She wants to come in. You must try. She wants to talk, Livia broke in. Does she? He asked. About what? What does Mummy want to say? But Livia said nothing more. Joachim said nothing either. He returned silently to his own bed. A Friday night at the end of November. The big vicarage at Haggleby lay at the end of a forest track 1/2 mile or so outside the village. Henrik and the Sorelius brothers had parked their van in a grove of trees up by the main road. Henrik had drunk more beer than usual. His nerves were at breaking point tonight. It was all the fault of the Sorelius brothers' Ouija board. They had conducted a quick session in Henrik's kitchen at around 11 o'clock. Freddie had lit the candles. Tommy placed his index finger on the glass. Is anybody there? The glass began to move straight away. Tommy leaned forward. Is it Alistair? The glass moved over to the letter A, then L. He's here, said Tommy quietly. But the glass carried on to G, then to O, and T, then it stopped. Algot, said Tommy. Henrik stiffened. The glass had begun to move across the board again, and he wrote down what it was spelling out. Algot, Algot, not good, alone, Henrik, not good, not living, not good, Henrik, not... Henrik stopped writing. I can't do this anymore, he said. It was 12:30 when they finally arrived at the vicarage. It was a cloudy night and the house was in darkness. Henrik was still pondering over the board's message. Algot? His grandfather's name had been Algot. Let's go, said Tommy. Abba Baba. He led the way up the stone path and the steps. Then he leaned forward and peered thoughtfully at the lock. Looks pretty solid, he whispered. Henrik shook his head. This is the country, he whispered back. He reached out, silently pushed down the handle. It wasn't locked. They were in a big, dark hallway. There were 3 doors leading off the hallway, 2 of them ajar. Tommy opted for the right-hand one. Henrik followed him. He could hear Freddie's breathing and heavy footsteps right behind him. The door led into a drawing room. Tommy opened a bureau. Henrik caught sight of something tall and narrow in one of the windows. It was some kind of old lantern, with panes of glass and lacquered wood, perhaps 12 inches high and 6 inches wide. Rather charming. It would go nicely in his flat if a fence didn't want to buy it. He wrapped a tablecloth around the lantern and pushed it into his rucksack. There was no sign of Freddie when they emerged into the hallway. Had he gone further into the house? A door opened slowly. It was the door leading to the kitchen, and Henry was so sure it was Freddie that he didn't even turn his head. But suddenly he heard Tommy gasp. Henrik turned and saw a white-haired gnome standing in the doorway. "What are you doing?" "I'm calling the police." Tommy pushed him back into the kitchen. The old man dropped his glasses as he stumbled in the doorway and collapsed just inside. Tommy followed him. There was something sharp in his hand, a knife or a screwdriver. "That's enough!" Henrik hurried over to try and stop Tommy, but stumbled over a rag rug and ended up standing on the old man's hand with his heavy boot. There was a crunching sound. "Come on!" somebody shouted, perhaps Henrik himself. Henrik stumbled backwards and banged into the marble table in the hallway. The big mirror fell to the floor with a series of crashes.
Everything was blurred, like on a dance floor, fast and unplanned. Then he heard a high-pitched voice behind him. He saw a woman standing by the man on the floor. She was even shorter and looked terrified. "Gunnar," she called, bending down. "Gunnar, I've called the police." Henrik fled, through the veranda and out into the night. Henrik ran across the grass and into the forest. Something grabbed hold of his foot, and suddenly he was flying through the air, straight down into the shadows, where the wet leaves and undergrowth received him. Something hit the back of his head hard. The night became blurred. He felt really bad. When Henrik came to, he was crawling on all fours, aiming for a black shadow that was growing up ahead of him, a little cave. He crept in through the opening and curled up. Someone was after him, but in here he was safe. It took several minutes for his mind to clear. He raised his head and looked around. Silence. Total darkness. Where had he ended up? He felt earth beneath his fingers and realized that he had crawled into an old stone-covered cellar in the forest near the vicarage. It was cold and damp. It smelt of fungus, kind of mouldy. Suddenly he got the idea that he was lying in an old death chamber, an earth cellar for the dead, where they lay waiting to be buried over in the graveyard. Henrik slowly crawled out of the cellar and set off through the undergrowth. Suddenly he heard a van door slam. He listened. An engine started up far away in the darkness. Henrik moved more quickly through the trees, came out onto a broad path and began to run. He saw the Sorelius brothers' van. It was just reversing out onto the road. He got there just in time and tore open the side door. "What happened to you?" asked Tommy over his shoulder. "I got lost," said Henrik. It took them a good half hour to unload everything and hide it in the boathouse, but it was worth it to feel safer. All Henrik had left in his rucksack when they got back was the old glass lantern. "We'll take a break," said Tommy as they reached the streetlights of the town. "A little bit of time off." "Okay," said Henrik. "We'll be in touch," said Tommy through the open window of the van. It was difficult to get to sleep. His forehead was aching and his nerves were buzzing throughout his body, but sometime after 4 he drifted off. A couple of hours later, Henrik was woken by the sound of knocking in the apartment. The knocking was coming from his rucksack. 3 knocks, then silence, then a couple more knocks. He bent down and unzipped the bag. The old lantern from the vicarage was inside, still wrapped in the tablecloth. Henrik lifted it out. The wooden frame of the lantern had cooled down in the van, presumably. Now it was getting back up to room temperature. That's why it was clicking and knocking. He placed the lantern on the kitchen table, closed the door and went back to bed. The sound of faint knocking could be heard from the kitchen. It was just as irritating as a dripping tap. In the morning, Joachim drove the children to Manus as usual, and when he got home, the house was silent and empty. At around 1 o'clock, he heard a car engine. A large wine-red Mercedes was driving up the gravel track at high speed. Katrine's mother had come to visit. Joachim took a deep breath, then went to open the kitchen door. "Hi there, Mira. I'm glad you're home. How are you?" "Not so great. I can understand that. This sort of thing makes you feel like shit." That was all the sympathy he got from her. He stepped aside and she swept past in a miasma of tobacco and perfume. In the kitchen, Mira took an apple out of the bowl and went on, "So, when are you coming to Kalmar to visit me?" "I didn't know we were invited." "Of course you are." She bit into the apple. "Come whenever you like." "Katrine never got an invitation, as far as I know," said Joachim. "Katrine wouldn't have come anyway. But we called each other sometimes." "Once a year," Joachim corrected her. "She rang you at Christmas, but she always closed the door when she was on the phone to you." Mira shook her head. "I talked to her just a month ago." "What about?" "Nothing special." She wandered further into the house, but stopped at the Ramba painting outside Joachim's bedroom. "I gave this to Katrine for her 20th birthday," she said. "Something to remember her grandmother by. She really liked it." "It shouldn't be hanging here," said Mira. "The last picture by Theorin that was sold at auction went for 300,000 kroner. "Really? But nobody knows we've got it here."
Mira stared intently at the picture, following the grey-black lines of the oil paints with her eyes. "There are no horizontal lines at all. That's why it's so difficult to look at," she said. "This is the way you paint if you've been out in the blizzard." "And Theorin had?" "Yes. It was our first winter here. They had issued a warning about snowstorms, but Theorin went off anyway. She liked walking inland and then sitting down to paint. She had problems with her eyesight after that. That was when it started. And of course she went blind in the end. Because of the blizzard. She couldn't open her eyes for several days. The blizzard lifted sand from the fields and mixed it with the snow. It was like having pins stuck in your eyes." "How many of Theorin's paintings were there to start with?" he asked. "A lot. There must have been 50. "And now there are only 6, is that right?" "6, yes." Mira's expression was grim. "The 6 that were saved." "And people say," Mira interrupted crossly, "I know what people say. They say I put them in the stove one cold winter and burned them so we wouldn't freeze to death." "Katrine said that wasn't true," said Joachim. "Katrine was born the year after it happened, so she wasn't there." Mira sighed. "I hear the gossip here on the island. Mira Ramba is a difficult old woman. Her boyfriends are far too young for her. She's an alcoholic. I suppose that's what Katrine said as well?" Joachim shook his head, but he remembered how Mira had staggered around at their wedding in Borgholm, trying to seduce his younger cousin. She took a last long look at the house. "I might come again," she said. "You do that," said Joachim. The evening after Mira Ramba's visit, the family were invited to their neighbours at the farm to the south. 7-year-old Andreas had joined them at the dinner table before he and the Weston children went into the kitchen for some ice cream. Joachim stayed in the dining room, drinking coffee with Roger and Maria Carlson. He eventually asked, "I wonder if you've heard any stories about our place, about Eel Point?" "Stories?" said Roger Carlson. "Yes, ghost stories or other tales," said Joachim. "She didn't talk to me about any ghosts," said Roger. "She did talk to me about it when she came over for coffee," said Maria. "She was just wondering whether Eel Point had a bad reputation." She looked at her husband. "I mean, when we were little, the adults used to talk about a secret room at Eel Point that was haunted. Do you remember, Roger?" Her husband just shook his head, but Joachim leaned forward. "Where was this room? Do you know?" "No idea," said Roger, drinking his coffee. "No, I don't know either," said Maria. "But my grandfather said something about the ghosts haunting this room every Christmas. The dead gathered in a particular room, and then they took—" "That's just ridiculous nonsense," said Roger, picking up the coffee pot and offering it to Joachim. "More coffee?" Tilda Davidson lay naked and sweaty. Martin was sitting on the edge of the bed with his back to her. Tilda should have realised what was coming, but she didn't. He had sat down on the edge of the bed and was looking out of the window. "I don't think we can do this," he said eventually. "Do what?" "This. All this. It's not working." He was still looking out of the window. "Karen's asking questions." "About what?" Tilda still didn't realise she was in the process of being dumped. Screwed and then dumped. Classic. She heard the door close and footsteps disappearing down the stairs. He would go out to his car in the square and drive home to his family as if nothing had happened. After feeling sorry for herself for more than half an hour, Tilda got up. She had a shower, got dressed, and decided to go over to the home to see Gerloff. But before she could set off, the telephone rang. It was the duty officer in Borgholm. There had been a break-in at a vicarage north of Manus. Work dulled Tilda's pain. When they had finished at the vicarage, Tilda got into her car and drove down to the home where Gerloff lived. "A break-in," said Tilda to explain why she was late. "Really?" said Gerloff. "Where?" "The vicarage at Haggleby. They beat up the owner." "Have you been looking for traces of the people who did it?" Tilda nodded. "Could you get me a piece of paper from the desk?" Tilda did as he asked and looked on silently as Gerloff wrote a few short lines on the piece of paper. Then he handed it to her. There were 3 names in Gerloff's neat handwriting. John Hagman, Dagmar Carlson, Edla Gustafsson. Tilda looked up at Gerloff. "Okay," she said. Are these the burglars?
No, they're old friends of mine.
Right.
They can help you, said Gerloff.
How?
They see things.
Okay.
They all live near the road, and they keep an eye on the traffic, said Gerloff. Start with John, down in Steenik. We're friends. Say hello from me.
And ask about strange cars, said Tilda.
Exactly.
Livia had developed a new sleep pattern. She would sleep peacefully for 2 nights, but on the 3rd night, she would become restless. Daddy! At least there was some progress, thought Joachim, as he went towards his daughter's room. She no longer called out for Katrine. He sat down on the edge of Livia's bed and stroked her back, waiting for her to start talking. After a couple of minutes, she began. Daddy? Yes, he answered quietly. Can you see anyone, Livia? She was still lying with her back to him. Mummy, she said. He was prepared now. Where is she? He asked. Does Mummy want to say anything to me? No reply. Where is she? He asked again. Where's Mummy, Livia? Still no reply. What was Mummy doing on the jetty? Why did she go down to the sea? She wanted to find out. Find out what? The truth. The truth? Who from? Livia was silent. Where's Mummy now? He asked. Close. Is she in the house? Livia didn't respond. Can you talk to her now? He asked. Is she listening? She's watching. Can she see us? Maybe. Joachim held his breath. He searched for the right questions. What can you see now, Livia? There's someone on the shore, by the lighthouses. That must be Mummy. Has she... No, said Livia. Ethel. What? It's Ethel. Joachim went completely cold. No, he said. That can't be her name. Yes. No, Livia. He had raised his voice. Yes, Ethel wants to talk. Joachim was still sitting on the bed, incapable of moving. I don't want to talk, he said. Not to her. She wants... No, said Joachim quickly. His heart was pounding, his mouth was dry. Ethel can't be here. Livia was silent again. He couldn't breathe anymore, he just wanted to escape from this room. But he stayed there on the edge of Livia's bed, stiff and terrified. In the end, he managed to stand up and forced himself to go out into the dark corridor and crept back to bed. On Saturday, the family had visitors, their former neighbours from Stockholm, Lisa and Michael Heslin. They had called a few days earlier and asked if they could stay over on Åland on their way back from Denmark. Joachim had been pleased. Both he and Katrine had enjoyed having Lisa and Michael as their neighbours. After they had all gone to bed, Joachim lay in the darkness listening to the murmur of Lisa and Michael's voices from the guest room. It felt really good to have them here. Eel Point needed more guests. Living guests. After a few minutes, there was silence in the house. Joachim closed his eyes and fell asleep. Loud cries could be heard throughout the house. Joachim woke up with a start, and an instant thought, Livia? No, it was a man's voice. It was Michael Heslin calling out in the darkness. Joachim got out of bed. The light was on in the hallway, and when he got there, Lisa was just putting on her coat and boots. He stood by the window with his cup and saw Lisa sitting next to Michael in the car. It was snowing lightly. Lisa seemed to be asking Michael questions. He was sitting behind the wheel, just staring out through the windscreen and shaking his head. After a few minutes, Lisa came back inside. She looked at Joachim. Michael had a nightmare. He says someone was standing next to the bed, watching him. Is he coming back inside? I think he wants to stay in the car for a while, said Lisa, and added, I think we'll probably drive down and stay the night at the hotel in Borgholm. He has been a bit on edge. Work isn't going too well right now. He doesn't say much about it, but... Quarter of an hour later, Joachim was back at the kitchen window, watching the Heslins' big car driving away. He climbed back into bed and lay there in the darkness, his eyes open. On Monday morning, he drove the children into Manus. At around 2 o'clock, he made some coffee and noticed that the door to the barn was half open. Hadn't he closed it on Friday, before the Heslins arrived? It was 20 steps over to the barn.
Joachim pushed the huge door open wide and stepped into the darkness. The old black switch was in the middle of the shorter wall. When he turned it, 2 small bulbs spread a pale yellow light across the stone floor, the empty stalls and feeding troughs. Everything was silent. Every time he came in here, he discovered something new, and now he noticed that the floor near the door looked as if it had been freshly swept. Katrine had mentioned something about the fact that she had been cleaning the barn when they were discussing the various buildings in the autumn. Joachim looked over towards the wooden steps up to the hayloft. When he got up there, he could see the rays of the sun shining in through the small panes on the southern side of the barn. Joachim moved slowly across the floor. Finally, he was standing in front of the far wall. As he stood beside the broad planks, he had a sense of darkness behind them. He suddenly got the feeling that this was not in fact the outside wall of the barn. Despite the fact that it was almost time to go and pick up Livia and Gabriel, he quickly went outside again. He took a few steps away from the barn and counted the small windows on the upper floor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he went up into the loft again. There were 4 windows, high up below the roof. The last one must be on the other side of the wall. There was no door or gap in the wall. Joachim pressed several of the thick planks, but none of them moved. Edla Gustafsson lived near Spetby, and the main road went right past her house. She seemed pleased to have a visit from a relative of Gerloff. Edla was cheerful and energetic, hardly bothering to listen to Tilda's explanation of why she was there. "I have 1 or 2 questions, Edla. I don't know if you've seen the newspaper, but there has been a break-in with serious violence in Huggleby, and the police could do with some help." "I've had a break-in as well," said Edla. "They got into the garage and took a petrol can." "Really?" said Tilda. "And when was this?" "It was the autumn of 73. "OK, but we're looking at more recent break-ins at the moment, over the last few months. Gerloff tells me that you keep an eye on the traffic." "There are so many nowadays. I don't write down the numbers anymore." "But have you seen any cars you didn't recognize over the past few days? Late at night, last Friday, for example?" Edla gave it some thought. "A big black car came past here last Thursday. It was heading north." "Like a van? Was it late at night?" "Yes. It was just before 12, after I'd switched the lights off, in the bedroom. A big black van. That's what it was." "Good. Did it look new or old?" "Not particularly new, and there was some kind of writing on the side. Kalmar, and something to do with welding." Tilda made a note of that. "Great. Thank you so much for your help." "Will there be a reward if you catch them?" Tilda lowered her notepad and shook her head sadly. After lunch, Tilda spent almost 3 hours at the local school talking about law and order with the pupils. She had several traffic reports to write up when she got back to the station, but couldn't quite let go of the drowning at Eel Point. She collected her thoughts, then picked up the telephone and rang the manor house. Joachim Westin picked up. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Did your wife know anyone who has a boat here on Åland? A boat owner close to your place?" "I don't know anyone at all who has a boat here," said Westin. "And Katrine, she never mentioned anyone with a boat either. Did she ever have any visitors?" "Only me, as far as I know." "OK, thanks," said Tilda. "I'll be in touch if—" "I have a question too," Westin interrupted her. "Yes?" "When you were here, you said something about a relative of yours who knew Eel Point." "That's right. Gerloff," said Tilda. "He's my grandfather's brother. I'd really like to have a chat with him." "About the manor?" "About its history and about a particular story concerning Eel Point." "I can ask," said Tilda. "Gerloff usually likes telling stories." "Tell him he's very welcome to come over." It was a new month, the month of Christmas, and it was Friday afternoon. Joachim had returned to the hayloft in the ice-cold barn and was standing in front of the wall. In his hands he held a hammer and a newly sharpened chisel. He had gone up into the loft an hour or so before he was due to pick up Livia and Gabriel. On the left, in the corner, a deep split ran along one of the middle planks. He pushed the chisel into the crack, hit it with the hammer, and the sharp metal went straight through the wood. All it took was a dozen or so hard blows with the hammer to loosen the end of the plank. It fell inwards,
and the dull thud when it landed proved that the wooden floor continued on the other side of the wall, but it was impossible to see what was in there. When Joachim bent down to look through the hole, just a couple of inches wide, a definite smell struck him. It rushed towards his face, making him close his eyes and lean against the wall. It was Katrine's smell. He got down on his knees and pushed his left hand into the opening. First his fingers, then his wrist, and finally the whole of his forearm. He groped about, but he could feel nothing. But when he lowered his fingers, they touched something in there, something soft. It felt like coarse fabric, like someone's jeans or jacket. Joachim quickly withdrew his hand. The next moment he heard a dull rumbling on the track outside, and a beam of light illuminated the windows of the barn white with frost. A car was driving into the courtyard. In the courtyard he was dazzled by the headlights. "Hi there, Joachim." It was a brisk voice that he recognized, Marianne, the head of the preschool. "Has something happened?" she asked. He stared at her in confusion. He had forgotten to pick up Gabriel and Livia. "I forgot what time it was." "It's okay," said Marianne. I was just so worried that something might have happened. I tried to call, but there was no reply." "Thanks," said Joachim. "Thanks for bringing them home." When she had reversed out of the courtyard, Joachim went inside, feeling ashamed of himself. He boiled some water for pasta and warmed the sauce. Several times he glanced out of the window. The barn loomed up on the far side of the courtyard like a black castle. It had secrets, a hidden room without a door. That night, Joachim called his former neighbours in Stockholm, Lisa and Michael Heslin. He hadn't heard a word from them since the night they left Eel Point. "Hi, Joachim," said Michael. "You in Stockholm?" "No, we're still on Åland. How are things?" "Fine. Good to hear from you." And yet Joachim thought Michael sounded wary. "I just wanted to check up, make sure everything was okay. I mean, it was a bit of a hasty departure last time you came down here." "Yes," said Michael, and hesitated before going on. "Sorry about that." "Lisa thought you'd had a nightmare," said Joachim, "that you dreamed someone was standing by the bed." "Did she say that? I don't remember." "You don't remember who you saw?" "No. I've never seen anything strange around here," said Joachim, "but I've felt things sometimes. And out in the barn I've found—" "So, what about the renovation?" Michael interrupted him. "How's all that going?" "What? Have you finished the wallpapering?" "No, not quite." Joachim realized that Michael had no desire whatsoever to discuss unusual experiences or bad dreams. The conversation didn't last much longer. "There's a hidden room at Eel Point," said Joachim to Katrine's mother, Mira Ramba. "A room without a door." "Really? Where?" "Up in the hayloft. It's big. I've paced out the barn, and the floor of the loft stops almost 4 yards before the outside wall." He looked at Mira. "You didn't know?" She shook her head. Mira lived in a spacious apartment close to the cathedral in Kalmar, and had invited Joachim over for dinner. "One of the police officers in Manus wants to carry on with the investigation," said Joachim. "She's called me a couple of times." "I know why she died," said Mira, drawing on her cigarette. Joachim looked up. "You do?" "It was the house." "The house?" Mira laughed briefly, but she wasn't smiling. "That damned house is full of unhappiness," she said. "It's destroyed the lives of every family that has ever lived there." Joachim looked at her, surprised by the comment. "You can't blame unhappiness on a house." Mira stubbed out her cigarette. Joachim changed the subject. "I'm having a visitor next week, a pensioner who knows the house. His name is Gerlof Davidson. Have you met him?" Mira shook her head. "But I think his brother lived close by," she said. "Ragnar. I met him. Anyway, Gerlof is going to tell me about the history of Eel Point. How did you end up at Eel Point?" he asked. "You and your mother." "The rent was low," said Mira. Joachim thought for a while, then asked, "Did Katrine ever talk to you about Ethel?" "No." "Who's Ethel?" "She was my older sister. She died last year, almost exactly a year ago. She was a user." "I've never really been into drugs," said Mira, "but drugs can open doors in your mind." Joachim stared at her. He thought of Ethel's blank expression and realised why Katrine had never told Mira about her. It was Wednesday, the second week in December, and Tilda and Gerloff were on their way out to Eel Point for coffee. Gerloff and the owner of the manor were to meet at last. Joachim Weston opened the door after the second knock. After a tour of the house, they sat down in the kitchen with a cup of coffee.
"Tilda said you wanted to hear some stories about the manor," said Gerloff.
"I'd like that," said Joachim, "if there are any."
"Oh, there are," said Gerloff. "But I suppose you mean ghost stories?"
Joachim hesitated, then said, "I'd just like to know if anyone else has experienced unusual things here. I've felt, or imagined I've felt, the presence of the dead at Eel Point, both out by the lighthouses and here inside the manor."
"Whatever you might feel of the dead, or whatever you think you might see," said Gerloff slowly, "it can be dangerous to let them rule our actions."
"Yes," said Joachim quietly.
"And to try to call them up, or ask questions."
"Questions?"
"You never know what answers you might get," said Gerloff.
Joachim looked down into his coffee cup and nodded.
"But I have wondered about this story that says they will return here."
"Who?" "The dead. When I was having coffee with the neighbours, they told me a story. Those who have died here at the manor return home every Christmas. I was just wondering if there were any more tales about that."
"Oh, that's an old story," said Gerloff. "It's told in many places."
Later they were outside saying goodbye.
"You have a beautiful home out here," said Gerloff. "But be careful of the blizzard. It doesn't come every year, but I'm pretty sure it'll come this winter. And it comes quickly. You don't want to be outdoors down here by the sea when that happens. Especially not the children."
"Okay," said Joachim with a smile. "We'll be careful."
"You do that."
Gerloff nodded and set off towards the car, supported by Tilda. But he suddenly stopped.
"What was your wife wearing on the day of her accident?"
Joachim Weston stopped, smiling. "Boots, jeans, and a winter jacket."
"Could I take a look at them?"
"Okay, but they're still all parcelled up," said Joachim. "I'll go and get them." He went back into the house. When Tilda had started the engine and driven out through the gate, Gerloff leaned back in his seat. "What was all that business with the clothes?" said Tilda. "Why did you want to borrow them?" Gerloff looked out through the windscreen.
"I'll tell you more very soon, when I've looked at the clothes."
After the break-in at Hagleby Vicarage and the flight through the forest, it was 2 weeks before the Sorelius brothers came back to Borgholm. But suddenly, there they were at Henrik's door one evening, at the worst possible moment, because by that time the quiet but rhythmic knocking in his flat had started to become intolerable. Every night he wandered back and forth between the bedroom and the kitchen, terrified of going to bed and turning out the light. In sheer desperation, he had called Camilla, his ex-girlfriend. They hadn't been in touch for several months, but she sounded pleased to hear from him. They had talked for almost an hour. Henrik's nerves were at breaking point when his doorbell rang 3 days later, and the sight of Tommy and Freddie at the door didn't exactly make him feel any better. Tommy was wearing sunglasses, and his hands were twitching. He wasn't smiling. It wasn't a friendly reunion. "You want money?" said Tommy. "Don't you?" Henrik sighed.
"It's not the money that's the problem. It's all the stolen stuff in the boathouse. We need to get it sold."
"We'll sell it," said Tommy. "But first we're going to do one more trip. The last trip to the north, to the manor house."
"What manor house?"
"The one with all the paintings. The one Alistair told us about."
"Eel Point," said Henrik quietly.
"That's the one."
That night he lay alone in his bed, and when he had turned out the light, the noises started in the hallway. There was a knocking sound inside the walls, quiet but persistent. Henrik raised his head from the pillow.
"Shut up!"
he yelled out into the room. The knocking stopped, then resumed.
Just when Tilda had stopped thinking about Martin Alquist every morning and night, the telephone rang in her little kitchen. It was Martin. "I just wanted to see how you were." "Fine," she said eventually. "Do you fancy having a visitor?" "No." It isn't Martin who's ringing, she thought. It's his hormones. He just wants a change from his wife again. The worst of it was that she still wanted him to come over. Preferably that very night. It was sick. Tilda worked long hours. In the evenings, she got into her own little Ford and drove around getting to know Åland. It was during one of these outings that she finally found the van Edla Gustafsson had mentioned. It said Kalmar Pipes and Welding on the sides, and it was black. Tilda made a note of the registration number and reversed into a parking space a little further along. Then she called the central control number. She asked them to check out a firm called Kalmar Pipes and Welding, but no such firm was registered. After 50 minutes, two powerfully built men, aged around 25, stopped by the dark van. The van drove away. Tilda followed. Eventually, they reached a high-rise apartment block not far from the hospital, and the van slowed down and pulled in by the curb. The men got out and disappeared through a doorway. Tilda quickly wrote down the address. If these were the burglars, then at least she now knew where they lived. "I'd given up on the investigation into Katrine Weston's death," said Tilda as she was having coffee with Gerloff a couple of evenings later. "Her murder, you mean?" "It wasn't a murder." "Oh, yes," said Gerloff. "I think it was." "Really?" "A few years before the war," Gerloff went on, "two cargo ships were moored up side by side. But aboard one was a first mate, and aboard the other an ordinary seaman. They got into an argument about something, and stood yelling at each other across the gunwales. Then it got serious. In the end, the guy from Degerham jumped up onto the gunwale to get across to the other ship, but he didn't get far, because his opponent met him with a boat hook. This was a sturdy wooden pole with a big iron hook on one end. So when this lamp came hurtling over the gunwale, his shirt got caught on the hook, and he stopped in mid-air. Then he fell straight down like a stone into the water between the ships, with his shirt still tangled up on the boat hook. And he didn't come up again, because the other man was holding him under the water." He looked at Tilda. "The rest of us broke up the fight and got him out. But he only just made it. Anyway, it was that fight I was thinking of when I asked to see Katrine Weston's clothes," he said. "And now I've had a look at them." He took an item of clothing out of the paper bag. It was a grey cotton top with a hood. "The murderer came to Eel Point by boat," said Gerloff. "He put in by the stone jetty where Katrine Weston was waiting, and she stayed where she was, so she must have trusted him. He was holding a boat hook, which he twisted into the hood of her top. Then he used it to drag her down into the water. Then he held her down until it was over." Gerloff spread the top out on the table, and Tilda saw that the hood was torn. Something sharp had ripped 2-inch-long holes in the grey fabric. "You can have the clothes back," said Gerloff, handing over the brown package to Joachim on the other side of the table. "Did you get anything out of them?" "Perhaps. But you don't want to tell me what it was?" "Soon," said Gerloff. "When I've finished thinking." Joachim had never visited an old people's home, but he was sitting here now, drinking coffee in silence in Gerloff Davidson's. "I have to pick up my children in an hour," he said. "Can we talk for a while?" "Of course," said Gerloff. For a long time, Joachim had wanted to talk to someone about what had happened in the autumn, someone who knew Eel Point. "I never asked you when you came out to the house, but do you believe in ghosts?" Gerloff shook his head. "I neither believe nor don't believe," he said. Joachim shifted in his seat and looked down at the parcel of clothes. "I'm worried about my daughter, Livia," he said. "She's 6 years old, and she talks in her sleep. She always has done, but since my wife died, she's started to dream about her." "Is that so strange?" said Gerloff. "I dream about my late wife sometimes, and she's been dead for many years." "Yes, But it's the same dream, over and over again. Livia dreams that her mother comes to Eel Point, but can't get into the house. Gerloff listened in silence. And sometimes she dreams about Ethel too, Joachim went on. That's what worries me most.
Who's Ethel?
Asked Gerloff. She was my sister. She was 3 years older than me. Joachim sighed. That's my own ghost story. Sort of. Tell me about her, said Gerloff quietly. Joachim nodded wearily. Ethel was a drug addict, he said. There was always an empty chair at the table. Ethel would be in the city centre looking for drugs. For her, that was just everyday life. My father used to go out looking in the evenings before he got too sick. I did too. On the streets, in the squares, in the underground stations, and the emergency psychiatric wards. We soon learned where she might be. 2 years ago, Ethel had been in rehab that winter, and it had gone well. She had been clean for almost 3 months, so we let her stay in our guest room. She used to play a lot with Livia in the evenings. They got on really well. One evening in March, Katrine and I went to see a film, he went on. When we got back to the house, there was only Gabriel, sleeping in his cot. Ethel had gone, and she had taken 2 things with her, my mobile phone and Livia. I found Ethel in the end, he said, looking at Gerloff. She was lying in the dark graveyard at Clara Church. She had curled up next to a tomb and passed out. Livia was sitting beside her in thin clothes, ice-cold and apathetic. I called an ambulance and made sure Ethel went into detox again. Then I drove home to Broma with Livia. He fell silent. Katrine made me choose after that, and I chose my family.
You made the right choice, said Gerloff.
And that night I told Ethel not to come near our house any more. But she did. We didn't let her in, but in the evenings she would stand at our gate, just stand there, yelling. Katrine started to wish that Ethel would die. And that's what happened. Yes, eventually. Ethel had gone down to the walkway by the shore, said Joachim. She had sat down by a boathouse and pushed the needle in. Then she had tumbled into the freezing water. And that was the end of her. Gerloff sat in silence, apparently lost in thought.
What did Ethel want? He said. Why did she keep on coming to your house? Was it just to get money for drugs?
Joachim pulled on his jacket without answering. Not just that, he said eventually. She wanted her daughter back as well.
Her daughter?
There was no father. He died of an overdose. Katrine and I were Livia's godparents, and social services awarded her care to us 4 years ago. We adopted her last year. Livia is ours now.
But she's Ethel's child, said Gerloff.
Not any longer. 2 weeks had passed without a single reported break-in in Northern Åland. But one morning the telephone rang in the police station. Tilda recognized the name. John Hagman was one of Gerloff's friends.
I hear you're looking for people who've been breaking into houses, he said. They've been here in the village.
I'll come down and take a look, said Tilda. Tilda got out of the police car on a gravel track in the middle of a row of closed-up summer cottages. A short, elderly man in dark blue dungarees and a brown cap came over to the car. He nodded briefly and pointed to a dark brown one-story house with wide windows.
There, he said. I noticed it had blown open. Same thing next door.
When Tilda went closer, she could see that the frame was split and broken open near the catch. The room inside was a mess. The traces left by the burglars were clearly visible. Any unusual traffic in the area?
No, said Hagman. I mean, the owners go home to the city in August every year. In September, there was a firm out here replacing some floors, but since then, there hasn't...
Tilda looked at him. A flooring company? It wasn't a plumbing firm, said Tilda. Kalmar Pipes and Welding? Hagman shook his head.
They were laying floors, he said.
Laying floors, said Tilda. She remembered the newly polished floor at the vicarage in Haggleby.
and wondered if she'd found a pattern.
When Tilda got back to the station, she called a dozen or so owners of cottages on Åland or in the Kalmar area who had reported break-ins during the autumn. 4 of the owners had had floors sanded or replaced in their summer cottages earlier in the year. They had used a local firm. Tilda called the owner of Marnus Fine Flooring to find out the names of the men who had been working in northern Åland. He gave her 2, Niklas Lindell, Henrik Jansson. Tilda was able to establish that of the 22 house owners who had had work done on their floors, 7 had reported break-ins over the past 3 months. Niklas Lindell had worked in 2 of the houses, but Henrik Jansson had worked in all of them. The silence was broken by the telephone. "Hi, Tilda. How are you?" said Martin. "Fine," she said, "but I don't have time right now. I'm in the middle of something important. But Tilda, bye." She put down the phone. It felt like a liberation. The strong wind died away before dawn, and when the sun rose next morning, Joachim saw that a thin layer of snow was still covering everything. Down on the shore, the waves had hurled ice up to form wide banks. Joachim peered towards the horizon, but the line between sea and sky had disappeared in dazzling mist. The telephone rang after breakfast. It was Tilda Davidson. "Joachim, you said before that your wife didn't have any visitors at the house, but I heard you had someone laying floors," said Tilda. Now Joachim remembered. "Yes," he said, "but it was before I moved here." "Did you ever meet him?" asked Tilda. "No, but Katrine did. One more thing. Have you had any uninvited guests during the autumn?" "Uninvited?" said Joachim, his thoughts immediately turning to Ethel. "Anyone trying to break in, I mean," said Tilda. "No, we haven't had anything like that." Tilda had brought a bottle with her as a present. "It's fun to talk, isn't it? I've found out so much about grandfather." Gerloff seemed hesitant. "But I haven't told you about the most important part yet. Ragnar taught me a great deal about the weather and the winds and fishing and sailing when I was a kid. But when I got a little older, I realised I couldn't trust him. I realised that my brother was dishonest. Ragnar was a thief," he went on. "Nothing more than a thief. I can't make it sound any better, unfortunately." "So what did he take?" asked Tilda quietly. "Well, he stole everything he could, by and large. He always kept an eye open for something that was left unlocked or unwatched. I don't think about my older brother too often. Ragnar was a shit." When she got back to the police station, the light on the answering machine was flashing. She started to listen to the message, but when she heard Martin's voice, she pressed delete. It was time he gave up. This was the shortest day of the year. When Livia and Gabriel had fallen asleep that evening and everything was quiet in the house, Joachim put on his padded jacket and left the house with a torch in his hand. He was going to visit the barn. He took a walk round the ground floor first. Someone had swept the stone floor, not everywhere, but in a strip next to the walls. It could hardly be anyone other than Katrine who had swept in here. In the right-hand corner, on the gable wall, old fishing nets and thick ropes hung from a row of nails. Several of them reached right down to the floor, like a curtain. But behind the curtain, the wall appeared to sink inwards. Part of the wooden wall was missing, and when Joachim pushed the curtain of ropes, there was some kind of opening by the floor in the gable wall. It only reached up to Joachim's knees. He lay down on his belly and wriggled under. There was another wall in front of him. It must be the outside wall. The space between was only about 3 feet wide. A couple of yards away, an old wooden ladder led straight up into the darkness. He started to climb. Eventually, he heaved himself up from the ladder. He had found the hidden room behind the hayloft. He stood up and swept the torch around in front of him. In its yellow glow, he saw benches, rows of benches. He was at one end of something that looked like an old wooden chapel. a little room set out with 4 benches and a narrow aisle alongside them. In the glow of the torch, he could see letters lying on them, and dried-up bunches of flowers, and a pair of children's white shoes, possessions, mementos, a folded cloth bundle, a pale blue tattered denim jacket, which Joachim thought he had seen before. He knew whose jacket it was. It was his sister Ethel's. Henrik knew the police were looking for him. He needed to get rid of the evidence. As usual, there was nobody around by the boathouse. The idea of hiding some of the stolen goods came to him as he stood inside the boathouse looking at everything they had collected during the autumn. Henrik had no real idea what was there, and he was sure the brothers hadn't either. His boat wasn't registered anywhere. There was no way the police could know he had it. Once he had taken it to the industrial estate outside Borgholm, he could drive out there and pick up the stolen goods whenever he wanted. Henrik decided to go for it. Eventually, he had carried over a dozen or so items and hidden them between the seats in the boat. He fetched a green tarpaulin from the boathouse, pulled it over the boat from prow to stern, and fastened it with a long nylon rope. When Henrik went back to lock the boathouse, he heard a dull roar through the soughing of the wind. He turned his head. Through the trees he could see a vehicle approaching, a dark van. The Sorelius brothers pulled in next to Henrik's boat. "Hi there, Henrik." The brothers walked towards him through the snow, both smiling. "We've come to collect stuff as well," said Tommy. Tommy went past him and walked over to the boat. Henrik's pulse rate increased. He should have got more ropes and knotted them tightly over the tarpaulin. In order to distract Tommy, he started talking. "Do you know what I saw out here back in the autumn?" "No." Tommy shook his head, but didn't take his eyes off the boat. "It was in October," said Henrik. "When I was here emptying the boat, I saw a motor cruiser. Must have come from the north. It put in up by the lighthouses at Eel Point. There was a man standing in the prow, and that evening they found her drowned in just the same place. I've thought about it a lot." He was talking too much and too quickly. But now at last Tommy turned his head. "Who are you talking about?" "The woman from the manor house up there," said Henrik. "Katrine Westin. I did some work for her last summer." "Eel Point," said Tommy. "That's where we're going." Tommy pulled the tarpaulin hard over to one side. "Aha," said Tommy, looking down at the objects in the boat. Then he pointed at the ground. "You should have swept away the tracks in the snow, Henky. You've been shuttling back and forth between the boathouse and the boat." Henrik took a step backwards. Tommy wasn't listening. He struck out, fetching Henrik a hard blow in the stomach and making him stagger backwards. There was a rock behind him. He slumped down on it and looked at the ground. His jacket was ripped. Tommy quickly went through Henrik's pockets and fished out the car keys. He just sat there on the rock, watching the Sorelius brothers. Freddie climbed unhurriedly in behind the wheel of the van. Tommy settled himself in Henrik's Saab. The brothers were stealing both his car and his boat, and all Henrik could do was watch. Henrik saw both the car and the trailer disappear slowly towards the coast road. Eventually, he took his hand away from his stomach and looked. The tear in his grey padded jacket was coloured red now. After a while, he managed to get up from the rock. He was actually able to walk. His intestines and his liver must be okay. With his hand pressed against his belly, he started to walk towards his boathouse. Henrik made his way over to his grandfather's workbench. Algott's old wood axe was lying there. He took the axe, then he set off into the snow. The Sorelius brothers had struck him down and stolen his boat, and they had talked about going up to Eel Point, in which case Henrik intended to meet them there. Tilda rang the doorbell of Henrik Janssen's flat. A teenage girl was coming up the stairs. Tilda said, "We're looking for your neighbour, Henrik. Do you know where he is?" The girl thought about it. "It could be at the boathouse." "Where's that?" "On the east coast somewhere." "Good," said Tilda. "Have a great Christmas."
A broad-shouldered man was sitting in one of the armchairs in Tilda's waiting room. It was Martin Alquist.
"What do you think you're doing?"
"What do you mean?" said Martin.
"You keep on calling me, and now you turn up here. Why?"
"Well, I wanted to see how you were."
"I haven't got time to talk now. There's a guy I have to pick up."
She walked out to the car park. Then she started the engine and pulled away. She saw a blue Mazda pull out behind her. Martin was following her. By the time Tilda reached the eastern side of the island, the daylight was almost completely gone, and the silently falling snow had become more intrusive. When she turned off onto the narrow track down towards Enslunda, Martin's Mazda was still a little way behind her. It was bitterly cold and desolate here at the edge of the Baltic. The cold and the emptiness made the entire coast feel menacing. The waves were rolling in and had begun to break up the covering of ice offshore. Martin got out of his car and walked over to Tilda.
"This guy you're going to pick up, is he supposed to be out here?"
She just nodded. The door of one of the boathouses was banging to and fro in the wind. Martin opened the door and peered in.
"He's not home."
Tilda didn't reply. She went inside and bent down. Small, shiny droplets could be seen on the wooden floor. "What do you make of this?"
"Fresh blood," he said.
Tilda went outside and looked around. There were indistinct tracks in the snow, a long line of footprints leading north. Tilda turned around and headed back towards the car.
"Where are you going?"
shouted Martin behind her.
"It's confidential,"
she replied, and carried on to the police car. Snow was falling thickly now. In her wing mirror she saw Martin following her. Tilda increased her speed before she looked to the east and saw that the horizon had disappeared. A grey-white wall of snow hung over the sea. It was dropping rapidly towards the coast. A storm was on its way. Joachim went along the stone pathway between the buildings, out into the wind and the snow. He remembered Gerloff's warning that you could get lost if you went out in a blizzard. Joachim walked into the barn, and it felt as if the wind were pushing at his back, as if it wanted to come with him, but he slammed the door shut. Inside the false wall, he stood up and switched on the torch. He could see the ladder leading up into the darkness. Joachim listened, but everything was still silent in the barn. He could stand here or start climbing. He hesitated. Just for a moment, he considered the fact that a storm was coming and Livy and Gabriel were alone in the house. Then he lifted his right foot and placed it on the bottom rung. Joachim's mouth was dry and his heart was pounding, but he was more expectant than afraid. He didn't want to be anywhere else but where he was now. Katrine was close. He could feel it. The wind along the coast had increased to storm force. The gusts shook the car, and Tilda clutched the wheel tightly. Blizzard, she thought. The road in front of the car disappeared completely. Tilda turned the wheel as the road curved, but not enough. Suddenly, the front wheel sank down into the snow. The police car stopped with a violent bang. A second later, she felt an even bigger bang. Martin's car had driven into hers. In the rear-view mirror, she saw Martin open his car door and step out into the snow. Tilda opened her door as well.
"You were too close,"
she said through the wind.
"You slammed the brakes on,"
he shouted back. She shook her head.
"Nobody asked you to follow me, Martin." "Well, you've got a radio car," he said. "Call the breakdown truck."
Martin got back in the Mazda, and Tilda struggled back to the warmth and quiet of the police car. Once inside, she used the radio to call Borgholm. "What's the situation?" asked Tilda.
"Chaos. More or less complete chaos. Where are you?"
"By Ofamosen, on the eastern coast," said Tilda. "I'm stuck."
"Do you need help? The snowplows are only working on the main roads."
"I'll be fine. If it gets colder, I'll just make my way to the nearest house."
"Understood. Good luck."
Martin wound down the window as he reached his car.
"Is someone coming?"
She shook her head and shouted back.
"We can't stay here."
"What?"
Tilda pointed eastwards. "There's a house! Down there!" A few seconds later, he got out of the car. Tilda led the way towards Eel Point, with Martin a few steps behind her. Henrik Jansen was fighting his way through the blinding snow. He hung on to the axe. He had to rest after every other step. The wind had increased in strength yet again, although Henrik had thought that that was impossible. He stopped and closed his eyes. Was death warm or cold? Somewhere in his head were the Sorelius brothers with their broad smiles. That got him moving again. A room for the dead, with its own church benches. Ethel's jacket had been lying there neatly folded among all the other old mementos. It was Katrine who had put it there. She must have found the room during the autumn without telling Joachim. His wife had kept secrets from him. Joachim stood in the barn listening to the wind roaring over the huge roof. He shone the torch on the denim jacket lying there, neatly folded. Joachim reached out and felt the worn fabric, as if touching it could provide answers to all his questions. When he got hold of one sleeve, something rustled and fell on the floor. It was a small piece of paper. He bent down and picked it up and saw a single sentence written in ink. "Make sure that junkie whore disappears." This was not a message to Ethel. This had been written to him and Katrine. But he had never seen it before. Katrine must have found it, pushed through the door one day. Joachim was very tired now, and sank down on the bench next to Ethel's jacket. He carried on staring at the note in his hand, until he heard a faint scraping noise through the wind. It was coming from the opening in the floor behind him. Someone was inside the barn. Henrik woke up to find his dead grandfather standing over him like a shadow in the whirling, powdery snow. Olgot leaned forward and raised his boot-clad foot. "Get up!" Henrik slowly lifted his head. He thought he could see light. Henrik had struggled along in a daze, yard by yard through the snow, but in the end he had made it. He could just glimpse the veranda of the main house through the curtains of snow, and he ploughed over to it. The door had been broken open. The Sorelius brothers had been here. Henrik pulled open the veranda door and fell headlong over the threshold. He staggered through the next doorway. He found himself in the big kitchen. On the worktop stood a block containing kitchen knives. Henrik grabbed the handle of the biggest one and pulled it out. He went back into the main house. He was standing in a long corridor in the doorway of a small room. A little girl of about 5 or 6 with blonde hair was sitting up in bed. "Hello," was all he said. The girl looked at him. "Have you seen anyone else here?" he asked. "Any other men?" The girl shook her head. "I just heard them," she said. "They were clomping around and they woke me up. I was scared to go out." "You need to stay in here. Where are your mum and dad?" "Daddy went out to Mummy." "And where's your mummy?" "In the barn. Can I go into Gabriel's room?" "Who's Gabriel?" "My little brother." Henrik nodded with some effort. "Course." The girl quickly jumped out of bed and scampered past him. Henrik went back out to the veranda. 2 shadows were moving out there. They slowly came closer through the snow. He wasn't sure if it was the brothers, but raised the axe anyway. By the time the outer door was opened, he had already swung it. Tilda staggered forwards in the swirling snow, Martin by her side. They had almost reached Eel Point now. Tilda could see the main house with faint lights shimmering in the windows. She started moving again into the inner courtyard, which was completely covered in snow.
It came up to her waist in some places, and she had to force her way through the drifts. She carried on towards the house, her gun at the ready. When Tilda reached the veranda, she looked at the door. The lock had been broken. She grabbed hold of the handle and opened the door. Then something slender and metallic grey came whirling through the opening. Axe was all she was able to think before it hit her in the face. She could hear Martin shouting in the distance. But by then she had already begun to fall backwards, down the steps and back out into the snow. The murderer had stepped out of the shadows among the trees, walked over to Ethel and whispered, "Come down to the water with me and you can have a fix of heroin from me, completely free." Ethel had nodded. Joachim shivered and pushed the dream pictures out of his head. A rumble like thunder shook him. He woke up properly and looked around him. He was sitting on the front row in the hidden prayer room. The torch had gone out and the only light came from the single bulb in the loft, seeping in through the narrow gaps in the wall. And the rumbling noise? It was the storm, roaring its way in over the coast. The blizzard had reached its peak. But Joachim thought he could hear other sounds too. Someone was walking slowly along the aisle beside him. He heard the scraping sound of footsteps from a figure passing all the benches behind him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that a shadow with a pale face had stopped beside his bench and was standing there, motionless. "Katrine," whispered Joachim, without daring to turn his head. "Katrine," he whispered again. "I've found Ethel's jacket and the note from the neighbours. Katrine, I think you knew who killed my sister." There was no reply. "Hello?" Henrik shouted to the figure in the snow. "Are you okay?" It was a stupid question because the body below him was lying motionless with a bloody face. A few yards behind her stood a man, as if he were frozen solid in the whirling snow. Then he strode forward and knelt down. "Tilda!" he shouted. "Tilda!" She moved her arms feebly and tried to raise her head, suddenly coughed and started vomiting violently in the snow. "Drop it now!" The man was talking about the kitchen knife, Henrik realized. He was still clutching it in his hand. He didn't want to drop it. The Sorelius brothers were around somewhere. The woman had stopped vomiting. She raised her head and shouted to Henrik through the howling wind, "Henrik Jansson, you're under arrest for robbery with violence." There was a sudden tinkling noise, just a couple of inches from his right ear. Henrik turned his head and saw that a black, uneven hole had appeared in one of the small panes of glass in the veranda windows. A figure had stepped out of the half-open door of the barn and was standing there in the snow. In the glow from the outside light, Henrik could see that the figure was holding a slender stick in its hands. No, not a stick, it was a gun, of course. A man in a black hood, Tommy. The gun in his hands jerked, once, twice. The face of the man in front of Henrik contorted suddenly, and he went down. Tilda saw Martin jerk on the steps. He collapsed and landed heavily in the snow just a few yards from her. She heard two more bangs from the direction of the barn. Tilda kept her head down. Her pistol. She had dropped it when she fell in the snow. She began to feel around with her hands. A figure was moving through the snow. He had a black hood over his head and a gun in his hands. When he realized that Tilda had seen him, he shouted something into the wind. She didn't answer. Her hand was still burrowing in the snow, and suddenly it felt something hard and heavy down there. At first the object just slid away, but then she managed to get hold of it. She pulled the gun out of the snow and aimed in the direction of the barn. "Police!" she yelled. The masked man said something in reply, but the wind ripped his words to shreds. "Abba, Baba," it sounded like. "Stand still and drop the gun!" The man stopped, but didn't drop his gun. He dropped to his knees between two snowdrifts, less than 10 yards away. He raised the gun and aimed it at her again, and Tilda fired 2 shots at him in rapid succession. Then she ducked back behind the drifts, and at almost the same moment the light went out. Everything went black. The blizzard had caused a power cut at Eel Point. So Ethel went down the dark paths, down to the water. There she sat down obediently and got her reward. Peace. The murderer waited patiently until Ethel's head was drooping, then went over and gave the unresisting body a hard shove, straight down into the winter water. Joachim was still sitting slumped on the bench, motionless. The storm continued to howl over the roof. "Katrine," he whispered. But she was no longer with him. "Katrine." She was gone. Then suddenly he heard something more than the wind through the cracks in the barn, someone shouting, a volley of shots somewhere down below the hayloft. The pale light that had been seeping through the wall from the bulb in the loft suddenly went out. The electricity had gone, Joachim realized. After several minutes, a flickering light began to glow somewhere in the barn, a pale yellow glow that rapidly increased in strength. Tilda got up slowly on unsteady legs. Martin was lying motionless a couple of yards away. His lifeless body was already well on the way to being covered with snow. She couldn't see the man who had shot at her. She moved quickly up the steps to the house. Inside the veranda was a dark figure, half lying on the rag rug just inside the door. "Are you hurt, Henrik?" she asked. "I've been stabbed." "Henrik? Who shot Martin?" "There are 2 of them," he said. "Tommy and Freddie. They've got a hunting rifle, an old Mauser." Tilda turned and jumped down from the steps, crouching between the drifts. She began to move through the snow over towards the barn. The broad doorway gaped like the opening of a cave. She peered inside, pitch black. The electricity was still off. With her pistol at the ready, she moved inside onto the earth floor. Suddenly she heard a faint tinkling sound. A second or so later it grew a little lighter around her, a flickering, dancing glow. A fire was burning next to the steep wooden staircase a few yards away, leading up to the hayloft. A man was standing on the far side of the fire. The man's gaze was fixed on the growing flames and his face was shiny. He looked excited. "Police!" she shouted. "Get down on the floor!" The man remained standing, his mouth open. "My brother's looking for a way out," he said. "Round the back." "Lie down." "Okay, okay." The man nodded and got down on his stomach with some effort. She quickly grabbed his wrists, pulled them back and slipped on the cuffs. She saw a shadow approaching out of the corner of her eye. She spun around. It was Joachim Westin. "Snow," he said. "We have to smother the fire." "Can you manage without me?" asked Tilda. Joachim nodded. Tilda left the burning staircase. She had to go back into the darkness. She kept close to the northern wall. Then a door appeared, and Tilda went through it. The room on the other side was large and even colder. Tilda stopped with the feeling that she wasn't alone in the darkness. She lowered her pistol, listened, and took a step forward. A shot rang out. She ducked, without knowing if she'd been hit or not. Her ears were ringing. She waited. Nothing else happened. When Tilda finally looked up into the darkness, she saw another closed door, 4 or 5 yards away. It was a way out, but there was someone standing in front of it, a man. He had rolled the balaclava up to his forehead, and his pale face bore a resemblance to Freddie's. He had an old rifle over his shoulder. Tilda steadied the hand holding the pistol, aiming at Tommy. "Drop the gun!" But Tommy just stood there like a sleepwalker, almost as if someone were holding on to him. His eyes were lowered and his right hand was resting on the door handle, as if he were on his way out. But his legs seemed to be incapable of movement. "Tommy?" He didn't reply. A narcotic-induced psychosis? She walked slowly over to Martin's murderer, silently reached out to his shoulder and carefully unhooked the rifle. When she nudged his arm, he suddenly gave a start and came to life. He fell backwards. The iron handle was pushed down and the door opened. It flew open, torn back by the storm. He tumbled out into a snowdrift, got up and staggered away. Tilda raced after him, out into the gale. "Tommy!" she shouted. "Stop!" Tommy had reached the low-growing trees on the edge of the forest. After 15 or 20 steps, he was a grey shadow. Then he was gone. By the time Joachim finally managed to put the flames out, almost the entire staircase up to the loft was charred, and thick curtains of smoke hung from the roof beams. There was a sudden scraping noise over by the barn door, and he saw Tilda come stumbling in from the storm. She had her pistol in one hand and an old hunting rifle in the other. She sank down over by the wooden wall and breathed out. "He's gone," she said. Joachim got up. "I have to see my children," he said, walking towards the door. "Will you be okay?" Tilda nodded. Joachim went inside the veranda and closed the door. A man was lying stretched out on the rug. Dead? No. He was just deeply asleep. Joachim walked into the house, but stopped in the hallway. Ethel was there. She was standing in front of the doors to the children's rooms. She had come to collect her daughter. Ethel was going to take Livia away with her. Joachim didn't dare go up to her. He simply bent his head and closed his eyes. "Trust me," he thought. He opened his eyes and went on into the house. The corridor by the bedrooms was empty. Tilda had vague memories of being helped up the steps to the veranda late that night. Joachim Westin was walking beside her. He led her to a big room where a mattress made up into a bed lay on the floor. There was a tiled stove nearby. It was warm, and she lay down. An indefinable amount of time later, she was woken by a droning noise and quiet voices, but she hadn't the strength to wonder what was going on. Then she heard Joachim's voice. "The cars can't get through, Tilda. They've borrowed an all-terrain carrier from the army." Soon after, the room was filled with voices and movement, and she was helped out of bed. She was lying in an army carrier. Someone beside her coughed. She recognized his clothes. "Henrik," she said. "What?" asked the man, turning his head towards her. "Henrik, have you done anything else I should know about? There was a death here on the point in the autumn," she went on. "A woman drowned. Some people heard a boat down by the point on the day she died. Was it your boat?" "Not mine," he said quietly. "But I did see it. I was standing by the landing stage the day she died. She had a visitor in a big white boat. It moored by the lighthouses, and someone was standing there. I think it was her." "We can talk about it later," she said. "I'm sure you'll be having plenty of interviews." Joachim lit fires in the tiled stoves at around 9, driving the cold out of the house. Then he woke the children. "Happy Christmas," he said. They'd fallen asleep with their clothes on in Gabriel's bed. That was how he had found them when he came in from the barn the previous night. Livia stretched. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded. "Mummy was here." "Here?" "She came in to see us while you were gone." Joachim looked at his daughter, then at his son. Gabriel nodded slowly. "What did Mummy say?" "She said you'd come soon," said Livia, looking at him. "But you didn't." Joachim woke Freddie, who was a quiet, calm young man without his brother. There hadn't been room for him in the carrier, so Freddie had stayed behind, handcuffed to one of the radiators in the hallway. "Still no sign of your brother," said Joachim. Freddie nodded wearily. Tilda had given Joachim the keys to the handcuffs, and he decided to show a little good faith and trust this Christmas. He released Freddie from the radiator. When the power came back at about 11, Freddie settled down in front of the television to watch Christmas programs. Livia and Gabriel sat down beside him. The telephone was working, and the first call came after lunch. Joachim answered and heard Gerlof Davidson's quiet voice. "So, now you know what a real blizzard is like." "Yes," said Joachim. "We certainly do."
Are you and the children alone now?
No, we still have one guest here. We did have several visitors, but they're all gone. It's been quite a difficult Christmas.
I know, said Gerloff. Tilda called me this morning from the hospital. There was something else before I forget. I've recorded something for you.
Recorded?
It's a few ideas about what happened at Eel Point. You'll get it when they start delivering the post again.
The police called to say they would be coming to collect the suspect from Eel Point if Joachim could just find them a piece of flat, open ground where a helicopter could land. He went out and cleared a square in the field behind the house. The helicopter swept in. 2 police officers climbed out. Freddie went along without making any kind of protest.
"Are you all okay here now?"
shouted one of the police officers. Joachim simply nodded. When the helicopter had vanished in the direction of the mainland, Joachim ploughed back through the snow over towards the road and the 2 snow-covered vehicles. He brushed away the snow from the sides of the larger of them, a van. Then he peered inside. Someone was sitting in there, motionless. It was a man, curled up as if he had desperately tried to preserve his warmth in the driver's seat. The key was in the ignition. The engine must have stopped sometime during the night, and the cold began to creep in. Joachim went back to the house to call the police and tell them the last burglar had been found. The wind stayed away and the sun carried on shining over Eel Point for the next few days. Pale sunlight filtered in through the cracks in the wall as Joachim pulled himself up into the prayer room. Everything was quiet. The letters and mementos still lay on the wooden benches, but no one was sitting there. He picked up Ethel's denim jacket, and suddenly his fingers felt a small, flat object sliding around inside the fabric. Joachim had placed the denim jacket in a plastic bag when Inspector Holmblad arrived 2 days after Christmas.
"I've got a few things I'd really like to show you. Would you like to come in for a while?"
Joachim led the inspector into the kitchen, where he had cleared the kitchen table. "There," he said. On the table lay the bag containing Ethel's denim jacket and the items he had found in the jacket. There was the handwritten note, and a small gold case that had been tucked inside the lining of the jacket.
"What's this?"
said Holmblad. "I'm not sure," said Joachim, "but I hope it's evidence."
"Where are we going?"
asked Livia as they drove away from Eel Point the day before New Year's Eve. "We're going to visit Mummy." 15 minutes later they pulled up at Marnus Church. At last they were standing in a row in front of Katrine's grave. The gravestone was covered in snow until Joachim bent down and quickly swept it clean so that the inscription could be seen. Joachim took a step backwards and stood between Livia and Gabriel. "This is where Mummy is," he said. The children stood motionless beside him.
"Do you think it looks nice?"
asked Joachim in the silence. It was Gabriel who reacted first.
"I think Mummy will be cold,"
he said. Then he walked cautiously up to the grave in his father's footsteps and silently began to brush away all the snow. Gabriel seemed happy with the result. He rubbed his nose with his gloved hand and looked at his father. "Well done," said Joachim. "Shall we go back to the car?" Gabriel nodded.
"I want to stay for a little while,"
said Livia, her gaze fixed on the headstone. Joachim took Gabriel by the hand and walked back to the main path. They waited there for Livia. After a few minutes, she joined them and the family walked back to the car in silence. At about 3 o'clock on New Year's Eve, Joachim took the underground to Broma to wish his dead sister a happy new year and to try to talk to her murderer. He reached the street where the apple house lay and went up to the closed gate. He gazed at his former home. The neighbouring house was the Heslins. He rang the doorbell. Lisa Heslin opened the door.
"Come in, Joachim," she said, "and Happy New Year."
"Same to you. Is Michael home?"
"He's only gone with the boys to buy some fireworks." Joachim moved into the main room, which had a view of the bare trees and the ice on the bay down below the house. "Can I put your stereo on?" he said. "I've got something I'd like you to listen to." "Of course. Is it music?" Joachim went over and inserted the cassette. "No," he said. "It's just talking." When the cassette started, Gerlof Davidson's slightly grumpy voice came through.
Right, let's see. I've been thinking a great deal about the death of your wife, Joachim. I think someone killed Katrine. A person who left no traces of themselves on the sandy shore and therefore must have come from the sea. I believe he's a powerfully built man, middle-aged. He lives or has a house in southern Gotland, and there he keeps a big boat with an inboard motor. The boat must have been big and fast to be able to cover a day trip between the islands, but at the same time light enough to be able to come into the jetty at Eel Point. But how did the murderer know your wife was going to be home alone that day? I think Katrine knew him. When she heard the sound of the engine approaching across the water, she went down to the shore. The murderer was standing in the prow, holding the murder weapon in his hand, when she came out onto the jetty. But your wife wasn't suspicious because he was holding something almost everyone uses when they moor a boat. A wooden boat hook. It's easy to grab the opponent's clothing with the hook. Then you pull, and the victim loses balance and falls into the water. If you want to drown someone, then of course all you have to do is hold the hook beneath the surface of the water. All that is visible afterwards is the odd small tear in the clothing. There are holes like that in your wife's clothes.
The crackling voice on the tape fell silent. Lisa had got to her feet. Who was talking? A friend. An old man, said Joachim. Was Michael at your cottage on Gotland when Katrine died? I don't remember. He must have gone down there sometime to take the boat out of the water, mustn't he? Lisa looked at him without replying. I was here in Stockholm the evening Katrine drowned, said Joachim, and I remember noticing there were no cars in your driveway. Nobody was home. Lisa turned her back on him. That's enough now, Joachim. I need to make a start. She went over to the front door, opened it, and looked at him. He left, and she quickly closed the door behind him. Joachim heard the lock click into place. He sighed and went out into the street, but stopped when he heard a faint noise carried on the air. It was the hum of a car engine. When it turned into the street, Joachim saw that it was Michael's car. Michael drove up to the garage. His two boys jumped out of the back seat and ran off towards the house, each clutching their own bag of firecrackers. "Joachim, you're back," said Michael, coming out into the street. "What did you dream about that night at Eel Point, Michael? You woke up screaming. Did you see ghosts?" "Sorry?" "You killed my wife," said Joachim. Michael was still smiling, as if he hadn't heard properly. "And the previous year you lured Ethel down to the water," Joachim went on. "You gave her a fix of heroin, then you pushed her into the water." Michael stopped smiling. "She was spoiling the idyll," said Joachim. "And perhaps junkies might give the neighbourhood a bad name, but I'm sure murder suspects are even worse. I think Katrine suspected something. She wanted answers. And you said you'd come over to the island to explain. You came over in your boat and met her down by the lighthouse with a boat hook." Michael walked straight past Joachim, as if he didn't exist. "There's proof," said Joachim. Michael kept on walking towards the gate. "Your business cards. Where did you keep them?" Michael stopped. Joachim moved closer and raised his voice. "Thieving is always a problem with users. They're always looking for something they can pick up. So when my sister went down to the water with you, she took the opportunity to steal something from you. Something valuable out of your jacket pocket." Joachim took a Polaroid photograph out of his pocket. It was a picture of a small object inside a clear plastic bag. A flat case, gold-coloured, with the words Heslin Financial Services engraved on the front. "Your case was hidden inside Ethel's jacket," he went on. "Is it made of gold?
I'm sure my sister thought it was.
Michael didn't reply.
I've already given this to the police, Michael. I'm sure they'll be in touch.
He stood there and watched Michael disappear up the path. His rapid footsteps gave him away. Joachim could imagine what the new year would be like for Michael, waiting for the police car to pull up.
Happy New Year, Michael!
Joachim shouted as Michael opened the front door and went inside. The door slammed shut. He was alone on the street again. He breathed out and lowered his eyes. He waited for a few seconds, then set off again, back to his little family, to celebrate New Year. Far away in the east, the first fireworks could be seen over Stockholm. The rockets drew narrow white lines against the night sky before they burst into a shower of light, then went out, like ghostly lighthouses.
Nigel Cooke reading Johan Theorin's The Darkest Room, translated by Marlene Delargy. The producer was Clive Brill, and it was a Pacificus production for BBC Radio.